Hello, dear ladies and gentlemen. This is Frank Motz speaking from ACC Gallery in Weimar, Thuringia, Germany, Europe. And I would like to welcome you to tonight's talk, event, lecture on the ongoing show of ACC, which is running until the 20th of February this year. The name of the show is Denunziation, denunciation, and this is what the show is about. I don't want to lose any seconds and minutes to get deeper into the thematic or curatorial aim of the show. I think defamation, denunciation, that says everything. And I would like to welcome Sheida Soleimani. She is, I guess at least, sitting now, and it's the afternoon in Providence, Rhode Island. Hello, Sheida.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
It's going very well. It's kind of late here already, and we are very happy to reopen our lecture series, which we started last year on the occasion of COVID-19. This series consisted of, I think, 35 or so lectures, talks, and so on. And since the situation is kind of repeating itself with other sorts or other species of viruses, we keep on going with this online lecture series, live streams into the world. And today we thought we invite two artists who were not able to come to the opening of Denunciation to talk with us a little bit about the artworks which we have selected to be exhibited on the occasion of this show. And we have as our second guest tonight Piotr Szyhalski, an artist who lives in Minneapolis. And so there are two US citizens. I guess both of you are US citizens, hopefully. I don't know. Okay, let's just start. Let me just shortly introduce our world audience to Sheida Soleimani. Sheida was born in the US in 1990 in Indiana. She lives, as I said, in Providence, Rhode Island. She is, she is as well as an artist and art activist, political activist. She is assistant professor of studio art at the Brandeis University in Massachusetts, right, Sheida? In Massachusetts. And so let's just start. We were only able to finance the production of 3 out of 5 existing photographed or scenario or theatrically photographed works by Sheida Soleimani. The photographic series is called Reparations Packages. And but first of all, dear Sheida, I wanted to ask you as an Iranian American multimedia artist, as activist and professor or assistant professor, are known for your impressive works about, for example, the victims of Iranian human rights violations and your critical commentary on the corrupt Iranian regime. As the daughter of political refugees from Iran, you always incorporate a political activist perspective and combine a variety of media and materials in your artistic work. Might it be sculptures, collages, performances, as well as photographs, but always in the foreground is the critical examination of the historical and current socio-cultural situation in the Middle East, normally. Would you describe yourself as a more or less political activist artist?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that activism can exist in so many different realms. And when it comes to the arts, I think so many times, historically we've seen, and you're in Weimar, Hannah Hirsch and all of the Dada collage coming out of that era in Weimar, Germany had so much political ideology behind it and is, a quiet way in a sense of poking the ribs of totalitarian dictatorships and regimes. And I think that, in a sense, the place of artists within society is not to change what's happening, because I think very few people have the ability to change, the scenarios that are happening in the world, but to be able to make commentary and bring some sort of criticality and awareness to the issues that are happening in the society that we live in is definitely a large part of my practice. In a sense, I think of that as activism. So I would say that I situate myself in that for sure.
I just read that you once said in an interview, which I recently read, I think it was in Bomb magazine. I think it's being published in New York City. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. You said, my parents introduced me to principles and beliefs that I aspire to in my life and my work. For example, speaking frankly to power, relying around difference, and confronting ignorance and misrecognition.
Absolutely.
One Halloween during the Iraq War, for example, my dad briefly became notorious in our cornfield suburb for constructing a scene involving George W. Bush in a casket.
Yeah.
Yeah. Activism as resistance, refusal, critique, but also repair, care, and compassion is something I cannot do without. I carry this activist impulse into my work. For inspiration, I frequently turn to propaganda posters and so on. That's what you said, that's just a quotation. I see two connections, actually, to some other of the works being exhibited in our exhibition right now. The poster series dedicated to COVID-19 and the year of 2020 by Piotr Szyhalski, which we want to talk to in half of an hour, and a series with effigies by Florian Gottke, the German artist living in Amsterdam. Could you get a bit deeper on the story with your father in Iran and on the aspect of propaganda posters in your art in general? Because we have it to do here with kind of, these effigies, the puppets which are being used on demonstrations and protests all over the world, which might be burned or not be burned. Also kind of a staging of a political scene or a political person, as your father once did. And we will talk a bit later about the propaganda posters, or kind of ironic propaganda posters as well, made by Piotr Szyhalski.
Yeah, absolutely. I think propaganda posters, I'll start with that, are such a huge part of my work. I'm thinking a lot about not just the history of Iranian propaganda posters, but across the board, all propaganda posters share a lot of common things. And I think the most that I see is when it comes in the form of symbolism. So, for example, right-wing posters generally will include symbols such as fire, whereas left-wing symbols, obviously, the fist is definitely a leftist symbol, but you see a lot of others that come up in propaganda posters. Hammer and sickle, obviously we know there's a connotation, but then sometimes we'll have a foot stamping something out, and then compositionally maybe something's below and the foot is above, and we're getting, that is actually leaning towards a right-wing ideology. So through looking at the history of propaganda posters, color revolutions and colors that are, signifying political movement and political parties, I think about bringing those aspects into my work and creating the photographs. So in reparations packages and in many other of my series, I think a lot about, how the composition tells a story outside of the symbols that are or are not involved. And then in Iranian propaganda posters specifically, there are a lot of symbols that have intense references, whether they be tulips, which are a sign of martyrdom, but also now have kind of turned into being a sign for Khomeini's regime, which they didn't used to be. Images like, the ice flower, which we call goleyakh, ended up becoming a symbol of resistance. So just like little minor tweaks of one flower versus another can hold worlds of different connotations. So those definitely become a large part of my work. As far as my father goes, my interest in these images and propaganda posters comes from the fact that he worked at a publication and was part of a publication that he would distribute underground and was persecuted for doing. And this publication obviously was a very Marxist left-leaning publication, which was against both the Shahs as well as the Ayatollah's totalitarian regimes. And so in this, he was trying to speak truth to power and trying to, democratically distribute information and, knowledge about what was happening in the government, whether it be the Shahs or the Ayatollahs, and was brutally stamped out and had to be in hiding for 3 years, and then consequently had to escape over the mountains, the border from Iran to Turkey through kind of Azerbaijan. But it was a really rough journey, and a journey that many refugees today don't, survive. So thinking about growing up with the stories, him telling me about the publication he used to, distribute, and all of the images that were a part of the publication and the ideas that they aspired to reach and communicate became a really large part of my practice, and very much still is.
That was when he had to escape? Was it in the 1980s?
It was, yeah. So he left Iran in about 83, 84. And then he ended up coming to the United States in 1986 after he escaped to Turkey, sought asylum in Turkey, then went to Italy to get his asylum paperwork, and then was able to be placed as a political refugee in the United States. And
you lived in Tehran, I guess, or in Isfahan, or in Shiraz? In Tehran.
He lived in Shiraz for a while. Shiraz. He was working at the medical school there with my mother.
Right. Well, in one of your recent bodies of work with staged photography, so to say, with the title Reparations Packages, which are on show now in our gallery, the series I think is from 2019 and 2020, you are walking with your artworks into, I would say, a little bit another direction as you did before. You're showing, as you've done so many other times, montages, collages of accusation variants in colonial and post-colonial history, where colonial states, among other things, defend themselves with denunciatory theses of exaggerated claims and insist that, for example, the transfer of cultural assets must be seen as their salvation. It's good that these cultural goods are being transferred in the colonizing countries. In working across form and medium, especially in photography, in sculpture, in collage and film, you often appropriate source images from popular or digital media and resituate them within defamiliarizing tableaus. What would you think? How is your photographic series of reparations packages related to the theme of denunciation and defamation? And what was the initial historical background for the series? How did it all start? Was it, for example, with the tensions between Iran and Iraq, which are depicted on one of the motifs on one of the photographs? So what is the kind of historical background of this photographic series, Reparation Packages?
So I'll start with the second question first, and then move into how it represents denunciation. But firstly, I would say that yes, it absolutely did start with the Iran-Iraq image. It wasn't the first image that I made, but it was the image that kind of started the idea. And if I think about all of my work, I think about the fact that, a lot of people, especially in America, will ask, oh, you're an Iranian artist. Does all of your work have to do with Iran? And it's a very irritating question to think that just because someone, is from a specific country or has an affiliation with a country, that all of their work becomes about that country. And I started thinking a lot in my last series before Reparations Packages and Medium of Exchange. I started thinking about the global networks of corruption in which Iran is a large part of. In Medium of Exchange, I was looking at the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was established in 1962 at the Baghdad Conference, and how Iran as an oil exporting country is really part of a huge global network that, is exchanging oil, but is also in turn abusing its citizens. And so I started thinking about reparations packages after that series, and thinking about, in the series with OPEC, I'm thinking about the 14 OPEC countries. every single one of those 14 countries has been colonized by a Western power because of their relationship to having oil. And so I started thinking about all of those countries specifically, and those, colonial kind of interventions and, relationships that have happened, or, non-consensual relationships, and what those mean today in 2019, 2020, and 2021. We have a lot of these countries that are asking for the colonizing countries, for something back. I'm really thinking about the global practice in which nations work out the ethics of historical injustices. And so it really did start with the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq having used chemical weapons, which under the United Nations, like humanitarian rules, it's not okay. And the fact that all of the kind of issues that were, going into the Iran-Iraq War really just came over a border crisis and a border kind of injustice. So we're looking at the river that divides Iran and Iraq. On the right-hand side, you have the city in Iran that actually has the most oil. And so there was also about this kind of relationship, Iraq, even though it is an oil exporting country, wanting to gain more kind of terrain in which oil was exported. I'm thinking about also these monuments that are created in these countries after wartime or during wartime. So on the left-hand side, you have all of these, Saddam Hussein was an awful man, but created all of these really interesting nationalistic monuments during his time in power. And you have on the banks of the river in Iraq, you have these monuments of soldiers that are actually pointing their hands across the river to Iran, implicating Iran and saying it's their fault, that there was this war. And then you have the swords of Bastia, which, are the it's kind of the victory arch that Saddam built in like one of the main cities that became kind of this staple of his nationalistic monuments. And on the right-hand side in Iran, you have the monuments that were destroyed during the war. Now, I think these images are important to say that there's not a specific country in every single one of them that isn't at fault. I think specifically in Iran and Iraq, I wouldn't say one is or isn't at fault. In other images like Indonesia and Netherlands, I would absolutely say there is a country at fault and a country to implicate. And so these reparation package images kind of become, it's not about pointing fingers as much as it is about learning the history. And growing up, especially in the Midwest in America, which is a place that recognizes only American history and only American history in the past 250 plus years, which is really about how old our country is, there's a lot of things that are overlooked. So in France and Algeria that we're seeing on the screen here, we have the bridge, the Rue Saint-Michel, which actually in the 60s had, you'll see the kind of source image in the middle, that black and white photograph, which in French says, "This is where we drown Algerians." So many Algerians were drowned and thrown off of that specific river. I'm also playing along with the ideas of postcard images and thinking about, when you are visiting a certain place, having this very painterly, picturesque postcard that's sent back home to advertise, this place as a destination spot, and thinking about these locations not as destinations for travel, but destinations of trauma and images and places where trauma has occurred. In the sense of denunciation, I think it's really important to denounce supremacy, and especially white supremacy, when it comes to a lot of these colonizing nations, especially with, France and Algeria. We have a long fraught history that's not over yet. And Algerians, are still suffering under a lot of French rule, even though they still might not be ruled by French government. There's still a lot there. The same with Indonesia and Netherlands. Indonesia is now independent as a country, but a lot of the things that happened when the Netherlands, colonized still leave marks on the country and leave marks on the people. And I think those are the things that I kind of want to talk about. If we also look at a lot of these countries, the reasons that they were colonized oftentimes has to do with oil. And so I want to talk about, furthering medium of exchange and thinking about these historical references, monuments to victory, promises broken, and objects and goods that are used to barter for lives lost. And what does it mean to barter for lost lives? How could you put a price on death?
Yeah. So Reparations Packages, the series, reframes the paying of reparations as a global practice by which nations turn the ethics of historical injustices into playing fields for geopolitical and economic interests. When we talk about something that cannot be repaired, in a way, is there at all, in your opinion, an appropriate way to keep on going with this worldwide problem? For example, concerning Germany, to talk now a little bit about Germany,
Sure.
schön, thank you. Oh, I didn't know that you're speaking German a bit. Concerning Germany, the Herero and Nama genocide was an ethnic extermination and collective punishment carried out by the German Empire against the Herero and Nama people in former so-called German Southwest Africa now, which is now Namibia, Windhoek, between 1904 and 1908. On 28th of May 2021, the German government announced that it was formally recognizing the atrocities committed as a genocide. The declaration was made by Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who no longer is the Foreign Minister or Minister of Foreign Affairs, who also stated that Germany was asking Namibia and the descendants of the genocide victims for forgiveness. 2021. In addition to recognizing the events as a genocide, Germany agreed to give as a, now a quote, gesture of recognition of the immeasurable suffering, 1.1 billion euros in aid to communities impacted by the genocide. This is just the one example of the German contribution to the whole problem. So, but back to the question, is there at all, in your opinion, an appropriate way to keep on going with this worldwide problem? Because you are actually criticizing the reparations packages, the Wiedergutmachungspakete in German.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ones that I'm looking at in images, like, I mean, we don't have it on the screen, but I can share mine. In Italy and Libya, for example, we have a highway, you know, the reparations can come in all different forms, and monetary, you know, reparations are very common, but for a lot of countries that don't want to pay, you know, let's say $1 billion, when Italy, when Berlusconi offered reparations to Libya when Muammar Gaddafi was in power, they offered a $50 billion infrastructure reparations that came in the form of highways. They were like, okay, Libya, you don't really have a great highway system. How about we help you and we pay 50 million, you know, $1 billion and build you a highway system? Well, the backhanded part of that package was that they didn't put the $50 billion in the pocket of Libyan, you know, workers and highway builders. They said, we'll only build you these highway systems if you can contract Italian workers to build these systems for you. And so those are kind of the backhanded reparations that I'm really focusing on the most. But I think every country still, even monetary reparations, don't solve the problem. And you know, there's backhanded ones, which I find humorous, like Italy and Libya. But then you also think about things like, you know, money, and you're like, okay, well, that's a good start, but do you just give money one time and then it's over? Is there a way of contributing to things in the future? Are you thinking about, I think education is a huge part of it. You know, what are we teaching in schools and in programs, and how are people learning information about, you know, how their country may have colonized another and what the implications that might have on the other country's people in current day. That's a big one for me.
Yeah. Sorry for the little jump, but another question came to my mind. How was it actually for your parents when they had to leave the Iranian state and moving to the Bible Belt in Midwest US? Did the American society, given that your family has an Islamic last name, welcome them, or how difficult was it to start a new life there? And yeah.
It was very difficult, and it still remains to be difficult. You know, I think now that I'm older, can recognize it a lot differently. And my father knew from the get-go that it would be that way. My mother really didn't know. And so they faced things a lot differently. My father is a lot more fair-skinned, similar to me, and my mother is a lot more darker. so she actually faced a lot of trouble based off of colorism and being in the Midwest and being someone that was dark skinned with having an Islamic last name. I remember when 9/11 happened, I started going to school and kids were asking me if my dad was friends with Saddam Hussein. Our house would get toilet papered, our cars would be egged, you know, all sorts of things. And they were aggressions that were not only micro, but macro. And I don't think they have ever really assimilated. I think the place of immigrants always is to find comfort where you can. And that might come, and, you know, my parents like to go to this like donut chain here called Dunkin' Donuts. That's their form of comfort, but that doesn't mean they'll ever be accepted into society the way that they would be if they were still in Iran. And even in Iranian society, they were still living in the margins and not being accepted. And so I think assimilation is a way that a lot of immigrants, you know, end up making things work, but it was really difficult and remains to be that way for my parents still. For me, when Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd, 2020 was assassinated, I have the same last name. And so many
That's
people.
what I wanted to ask you, yes.
Yeah.
You're not related to him.
No, absolutely not. It's not the most common last name, but it's a pretty common last name. Yeah. And so the scope of a lot of people in America to hear that last name and immediately think that I was related would be like someone saying, oh, John Smith died. Oh, like my friend is named David Smith. I wonder if he knows John Smith. You know, it's like that type of like reference point isn't the same for people here. And that was real. It made me really angry, but it also made me realize that, you know, there's a lot of ignorance. And I think that ignorance comes from a lack of education about countries that are not one's own. Yeah, and that's also a huge motivator for my work. But yeah, I was in the airport the day after that happened, and I got questioned by TSA. And I got lots of messages and text messages from my friends asking if I was okay. And so I started like running with it as a joke. I was like, oh yeah, I'm fine. He was my uncle. Because people actually believed me. And I think that ignorance is something that I've always played around with. I like to use humor as a way to implicate people to think about their conditioning and how they, you know, come to the ideas and the decisions they do about other things in the world.
Well, and we hope you didn't get too much in trouble in the US while using humor and sarcasm, not only in art, but also in your private life. So, yeah. So your artworks, especially the ones we see in my background here, are stage sets, yeah, or set designs, constructed photographs, or one could even say built tableaus. Therefore, the depicted images and objects, so the cultural signifiers and the monuments charged with national identities and colonial legacy, are losing their depth. Everything is in focus. There is actually a background and foreground is melting together. Everything is visible. Everything has an equal value. This is how you are, this is what I read. Also, I think in Bomb magazine, you are flattening the image. You make it more flat to kind of de-hierarchize the image. A kind of, I would say, democratization of the different motives. So what is so interesting for you about this process, this constellation, this artistic practice, and its aesthetic results of flattening?
Absolutely. Flattening is really important to me because you did mention de-hierarchizing, and I think that's a big one. When I teach photography, as a professor, I always ask my students to look at the hierarchy in an image. What is in focus or what isn't in focus? What's in the foreground? What's in the background? And if something's in the foreground, does it have more importance or does it become the subject matter of the image? And I think when everything is flattened and is at the same level of focus, there is no foreground, there is no background. You know, the background painting is just as important as the monument that is in front of it, for example, in these images. And so I think flattening all of these images also is a form of reasserting violence. I mean, these are three-dimensional scenes. And if we're thinking about the history of photography, it's quite problematic. You know, we could think about how we are essentializing not just people, but we're essentializing places built off of our understanding of stereotype and our understanding of prejudice. And when we look at images, we often whether we think that we are not prejudiced or not stereotyping, we will jump to specific ideologies based off of the society that we've been raised in. And so I think if there is a way to take all of those images and flatten them, it also is reasserting that same violence that we do as viewers when we're looking at photographs. Because I don't think there is a non-violent way to look at a photographic image, unless it's like of a flower, or like of a sunset. But then we're getting into the ideas of like the sublime. And so I don't want to really create sublime images in that sense, but I want to create images that are beautiful, but are also kind of dripping with criticism that are implicating us to question how we see and why we see the way that we do.
So in your studio, I read it's a home studio. So you have your studio at home, right?
Yes, I have a building behind my house. So it's not technically in my house, but it's like a building in my backyard.
Yeah. So this is where everything is going to be being produced. So, but of course there is a background. So the background is always a painted one, and then you are setting up the photos and the photos of the objects and the photos of the photos, basically in the non-existing foreground.
Exactly. Yeah. For reparations packages, it's actually the only one of my series where the backdrop is painted. That's the first time I've tried that. More often, I'm using a bunch of different photographs and layering them to create a backdrop. But specifically in reparations packages, I am playing around with the idea of postcard photography and kind of painted postcards.
Yeah. To get back to your methods, this cutting and splicing and resituating or relocating the images to produce distorted and grotesque figures. I mean, you talked about it a bit before. With other words, the collage and the montage was a very common artistic practice, for example, during the time of the Weimar Republic in Germany. Would you say that this as a historical reference is of interest for you still nowadays when you 100%. Produce your art? Yeah.
100%. I'm really interested in artists like Hannah Hosch and John Hartfield, and I think a lot about Dada collage. And, it's one of the first times that we see the act of cutting, as a violent act that is denouncing, a lot of politicians. I think the cut in the beer belly of the Weimar cultural epoch, that piece of Hannah Hosch's has a bunch of mechanized, and cut open politicians. And that was, we might look at that image now in 2021 in a media saturated economy where we're constantly seeing things on our Instagram feed that don't seem that aggressive. But if you actually look at that image and you think about the time that it was made, it really is a very intense and violent way of saying, hey, I don't like this and I don't stand for it. And, I think that every time that we see some sort of artistic avant-garde, we see a time of societal upheaval that also corresponds with it. And I think I'm really interested in all of those moments of societal upheavals that produce kind of new genres or new methods of making and work. But yeah, I'm absolutely very much inspired by that.
Very good. Please contact our very good friend, the Australian-based or Sydney-based artist, Deborah Kelly. She's like you, she's a collagist and montage person like you. I will give you her email address. I think this would be a wonderful contact. The last two questions, because I already got a sign from our director, our cultural director, concerning your artistic practice. Can you briefly describe what you are currently working on? Is the whole field of colonial and post-colonial questioning and questions still a major aspect or even the center of your artistic practice? I just read that you are planning a show in 2023 called Reparation Packages in the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia. So it's still a theme, I guess. You're still working on that series?
I am, absolutely. It's interesting because I'm working on 5 different series simultaneously right now. So Reparations Package being one of those series, and definitely thinking about colonial and colonialism relationships are important to my work, and they continue to be. The works that I'm working on right now, one is called Absolute Powers. I'm thinking about historic moments from the United Nations and kind of thinking about recreating these moments. So like a lot of photographic recreation, but also thinking about the history of photography and body language and gesture as a way of how we read politicians and how we think someone might be quote unquote good or bad. And then the new series that I'm working on is actually for the first time a little bit personal. I'm telling my parents' story from their time of their escape all the way up to, their immigration, because it was quite traumatic. And my mother was imprisoned and tortured. And so I'm using their narratives as a way to create tableaus and photograph them for the first time ever. So yeah, that's what
right. Very interesting. So my last question is a bit out of a bit, let's say, far away, maybe not as far as I would guess. You also said that if anger often drives you in your art making, you also spend a lot of time on care. We've noticed that already, caretaking. You are also a wildlife rehabilitator, a wildlife rescuer, we could say. So you take care of hundreds of birds for 4 months each year, and you spend 5 to 6 hours during those 5 months with them each day. How does this relate to your work as an artist? And are sometimes both professions melting into each other? Would be my last question for today. And then we have to finish because we have to keep on going with Piotr Szyhalski.
Absolutely. Yes. I guess answering it backwards, it comes into my work very much. Lately it has been. And I was asked by the Fabric Workshop curator to think about relationships of care and how my bird rehabilitation does come into my work. And I think a lot about it, not just being my, just as a bird rehabilitator, but I think about the ideas of governance and how governments don't care for their societies, and how my work as a bird rehabilitator, animal rehabilitator is to, be a steward and to care for these creatures that come into my, care, and then to re-release them into the wild. So I'll screen share to show you a photo right now. In my bathtub, I currently have this great blue heron, which came into my care 2 days ago. So she'll be with me for the rest of the winter, and I have to feed her live fish. And yeah, this is just kind of, it's a form of therapy. I think we know that the art world as well as academia can both be not the best places. Sometimes they could be enriching, but sometimes they could be frustrating. And this is my way of, dealing with that frustration and finding other avenues for care.
Super. Thanks so much for all the answers, and thanks for the talk.
You.
We hope you stay online with us if you still have the time, because we will be now talking with Piotr Szyhalski, and we go inside the US. We go now from Providence, Rhode Island to Minneapolis, which is in Minnesota, right, Piotr?
Thank you.
Yes, so it is.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me find out if I
can
find
I just say, Sheida, what a pleasure to hear from you and get this insight into your work, specifically that's at ACC, but also just the larger practice and ways of being as an artist. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you so much. And I'm also supposed to tell you that Nicole Killian says hi.
The Cranbrook connection.
It's true. Can't wait to hear about your work.
So, hello, Piotr. Hello, Minneapolis. So now I would like to introduce you to multimedia artist Piotr Szyhalski. His practice spans an impressive array of media and genres, from poster design to experimental music, from the interactive web-based art to large-scale conceptual installations, from public performance to innovative pedagogy. His moving images, his paintings, photographs, drawings, sound works, and designs explore questions about human ecology and to extreme historical phenomena. So, Piotr studied first of all in Poznan in Poland. He's born in I think in 1967 in Poland. He studied illustration, photography, poster design at the Academy of Visual Arts in Poznan. He came to the US from his native Poland in 1990, so shortly after the political changes, to take part in the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Massachusetts. Since then, he has spread his work internationally. He has performed and exhibited in many countries of this world and won numerous awards. And his works were exhibited in museums, festivals, and other events worldwide. He, in the work being shown at ACC, and you see now in my background, I guess, reflects, or he reflected on the events of the COVID-19 crisis in the medium of the poster, and it's historically often ironic, but also often defamatory use in the field of propaganda and counter-propaganda. So my first question, dear Piotr, and nice to meet you this way because we have never met each other before, and we hope you will still make it during the duration of the show until 20th of February
sure hope so.
to come to Germany. Let's see. So your own two MFAs, which you received from the Academy of Fine Arts in Poznan, Poland, one in drawing, the other one in poster design. How important was or is this more or less traditional art education for you, for your nowadays artistic practice? So what you've learned in Poland, how often and how intense you can use this knowledge in your artistic handwriting, your artistic practice right now?
Interesting. I think that, well, first of all, earlier you were hoping that we're both U.S. citizens. I'm not a U.S. citizen. Just wanted to clarify that I am a legal alien. That's my that's my legal status in the U.S.
Like Sting, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I did want to bring it up because in many ways it really does connect to just my sense of being a question of what it means to be a citizen. Really, I feel like in legal sense I'm not a full citizen in this country, but in many ways I feel that part of my responsibility as an artist is to participate in the democratic space, participate in the life and function of the society. And I do consider that an important form of being a citizen, of citizenship. Anyway, so back to your question. I would say in many ways, the work is always a kind of a cumulative product of experiences, insights, information, emotions that we gather through life. This current project, or the project that is right behind you, the COVID report series, is really a good actually reflection of that, because in so many ways it connects to the work that I'd done just directly before it, that consisted of these sort of small hand-painted plates where I did a lot of hand-painted typography that sort of led into this whole series that was painted with a brush and ink. But it also connects to the work I've been doing back in Poland in the 80s, when I was engaging with mail art and kind of producing these very graphic artifacts that were operating somewhere between a postcard, poster, language. And so these connections are very real. And I would say decades ago, I realized that part of kind of a unique opportunity that we have as artists in our work is to be thoughtful about how those connections are made, how the connections operate between different artworks done in different points in time. In many ways, acknowledging the fact that all of it is really a kind of a one continuous statement. I try to be really intentional about this and make those connections present, sometimes more, sometimes less obvious, but always there nevertheless, so that the ideas can unfold as a kind of a network through the variety of projects. So that crazy practice that you described with lots of formal outputs, in many ways it sounds very eclectic and disconnected, but to me is actually connected in a very real way by a set of ideas and kind of intellectual network that that brings a sense of cohesion to it. So. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how important was that background? Well, part of it is that I really do feel like language of posters present in my work always. Even when I work with sound, I feel like there's a relationship between text and other sort of textures within that work. If I work with paintings, the text appears in a relation to the images, much in a way that I really think of poster as a kind of a unique balancing act between texts and images, a kind of a intellectual shortcut that this tension can produce. So yes, it is present very much.
So you are 54 years old now, 2 years
Oh my
younger.
God.
Are you 54? Yeah, I guess
I have
so.
no idea.
Okay, don't tell us.
What year is this, Frank?
This is 2022, you are 54. That means you were 11 years old when Polish citizen Karol Józef Wojtyla became Pope John Paul II.
Yes.
You were 13 when John Lennon was shot dead by Mark David Chapman in front of the Dakota House in New York, in Manhattan. You were 14 during the appearance of the independent self-governing trade union Solidarity, the Polish trade union, or Solidarność, and its leader Lech Walesa. And I guess without Solidarność, by the way, you wouldn't live in the US right now. And you were 19 when the disaster on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant occurred. Having grown up in Poland until 1990, do you remember these events? And have they had any influence on your private or professional biography?
Of course. It's kind of incredible to hear you say these things, to be honest. They absolutely formed the way I think, who I am. Not just these things, a lot of other things as well, right? But the sense of operating within social space, of living in an environment where anything and everything is a political act, in many ways became a foundation for my thinking about what is it that artists do exactly. And I think that really also relates to the connection and kind of appreciation of poster, an art form that really is designed to function in the social space, in the public space, in a democratic space, in a way, language that is designed uniquely to, I don't know, facilitate that kind of friction or discourse that perhaps is an aspect of what democracy really is. So yeah, all of these things, of course, had an effect. But maybe this is an opportunity for me to say that it's astounding. One of the biggest lessons. It was great to hear Sheida talk about the kind of shifts between acknowledging the realities of life in the United States versus in this other outside context that we immigrants bring to the table. One of the most astounding things for me, and this goes all the way to the experience of the 2020 with COVID, with the last year of the regime here in the States, just how many echoes of the experiences that you kind of touched on from Poland I was feeling here. And a silly example of people immediately buying out all the toilet paper in the US and seeing
same here, the same here.
Exactly. So seeing empty shelves in the Target in the United States, the most powerful country in the world in the 21st century, and thinking, oh my God, this is Poland in the 80s. How did this happen? How did we close that circle? I mean, it's a kind of a funny example, but honestly, those circles, those echoes, unfortunate, kind of tragic echoes or repetitions are plentiful in all kinds of ways. Seeing what was happening to the to the kind of political, social landscape of life in this country was it was dark for me to experience these things, especially because, you know, back then in Poland before 1990, folks, and myself included, looked to United States as, you know, the promised land. This is where this was our hope. So it's anyway, it was a great sort of verification of these ideas that had unfolded over the decades that I've been here now. So
3 decades these are, right? Three. You have been there for 32 years actually. But you are a professor also, a professor for media arts at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design,
correct.
the MCAD. There you are supervising doctoral students, PhD students, and you are teaching graphic design, illustration.
Not PhD, that we have MFA program, and I
MFA,
have been working, yeah.
Right. So you are teaching also graphic design, illustration, and fine arts humanities, including your, as we have heard, very popular discipline, politprop, art for the broad masses of the people, right, in which the students study the historical and contemporary concepts of propaganda. Now, back to propaganda. Please tell us a bit more about the subject of this study or the studies. Why is it important nowadays to teach propaganda art? Yeah,
well, so politprop was something that I did in the 90s, when it was very first few years of me being in the maybe 90s, early 2000s. I honestly can't remember exactly. And I maybe taught this course just a handful of times, 5, 6 years maybe. I can't really remember. So it's not something I do right now, which is incredible because so many of the students from those politprop classes way back then actually reached back to me during the 2020 when I was working on the COVID report project, because the relevance of all the things that we were talking about or exploring back then suddenly reached a whole new level. It was a different environment in the late 90s, early 2000s, at least in the US, to talk about propaganda art and just the propaganda as a historical phenomenon. And to talk about it during the years of the previous regime in the US would be a wholly different conversation. And my school also is a different place right now. I'm not really sure if I actually could teach that class right now the way that that I did it, decades ago. But my idea for the class actually came from this. So Sheida sort of touched on this a little bit by talking about the sort of automatic assumptions that people have about folks coming from particular backgrounds. So me coming from a communist Poland, automatically I was an expert on propaganda, and people would ask these questions endlessly. And frankly, I wasn't all that interested in that idea, but because it was such a big part of a conversation, I thought, okay, well, let's just kind of research this and see if we can kind of formally address these issues. And so I tried to, research these ideas, and not just in the context of communist sphere of influence in the world, but actually rooted in, or at least acknowledge it in the kind of American reality, as well as bringing a more global perspective. And my thinking about this was that it is always an important skill to be able to understand how propaganda operates, how to recognize it, not just for artists, but for anybody, to understand what's going on around you and how these ideas are manipulated or presented to us. And then for artists also, understanding how these mechanics work, not that anybody should suddenly make propaganda art, but to use some of the, the mechanics or the strategies of that world to introduce in one's own practice, was something that I was sort of hoping would become part of that experience. And I think for many folks it really ended up being the case. And it's always interesting to see how we assume that propaganda only exists somewhere else, not where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the drawings in the COVID report series addresses this, the kind of amazing euphemism that, because in US, we don't do propaganda. We do perception management. There's always always like a fancy way of naming something that somehow makes it a little less problematic.
Yeah. So let's get back to what is in my background here, your labor camp project. It is also to be experienced on the internet under laborcamp.org. It celebrates the beauty and dignity of work through visual art, through music, posters, printed ephemera, performances, and public actions. You started this long-term project already in 1998 when you were still teaching propaganda, I guess, and it is still ongoing. It's still ongoing since 24 years now. That means that your COVID-19 Labor Camp Report 2020 is just a small part of it. What else is it that the Labor Camp project consists of, or consisted of before the COVID-19 project?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that you mentioned this idea of extreme historical phenomena, and I guess that's that, and everything I said about the sort of thinking about one's body of work as one larger entity. To me, the labor camp framework kind of became that. It organically expanded in a way that at this point, I feel like I can hardly imagine making a work that somehow isn't part of that network. Part of it is that the very notion of what I think of when I think of labor camp, within my work, had been shifting over the years as well. It's a long time to kind of think about set of ideas, and it expands, contracts. So one thing that I feel is definitely provides this really strong through line for a variety of projects is that attention to these extreme historical phenomena. It means looking back at historical events and attempting to learn somehow from them so that we can see where we are right now with a little bit more of a distance. And I see that attention, or that sort of impulse to pay attention not just to what happens now, but to what happened in the past, in a variety of projects, right? So these could be performances, these could be installations, events, but also physical objects, texts, et cetera, et cetera. And the COVID report is one of those. The unique aspect of the COVID report is that, unlike looking back at historical events, in this case, that extreme historical phenomenon was unfolding in the now. So as an artist, I was suddenly able to process that information sort of from within, if you will, being on the ground in the middle of that unfolding, clearly historical dynamic. So there is something quite unique about that. I think the first time that I had that experience was some years ago, working on the project entitled Theater of Operations, and it was a sort of undertitled "The First Sonic Reenactment of Iraqi Freedom Operation," and it was a project that I built during the Iraq War, based on the helmet cam footage of the American soldiers in Iraq. And there was a kind of unpacking of these narratives, a certain kind of witnessing of that phenomenon, of that experience that was happening through reenactments of these texts that were transcribed from those videos. So very intimate, kind of embodied experience of something that also was presented to us through mass media as a wholly different narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that we watched war in Iraq like a football game, right? Like an event.
Or an opera, somebody said,
Absolutely. However, yeah. So on August 14th, 2020, you wrote in your explanations for the poster of the same day, within the frame of the COVID-19 project, truly unbelievable that we need to protect ourselves and the country from our own government. Donald Trump is right now preparing to be re-elected on November 5th, 2024. How much danger is there that Trump will be re-elected? I mean, wasn't it Minneapolis, Minnesota, your hometown, where white police officer Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020, publicly killed 46-year-old African-American George Floyd, who was lying on the ground by kneeling on his neck with his full body weight for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. What has been the political situation since then in your electoral home?
That is a lot, Frank. I don't know if I can really address all of these things, but it is incredible. It was incredible. It continues to be incredible. One thing that I wanted to also say, just before this, I looked at the online resource that I used throughout the COVID report series. Each of the posters, or the ink drawings, as I also refer to them, has not just a date, but also the number of cases and deaths. Yeah, and so I looked again at the numbers, and it is astounding, really, to realize that just in the United States, nearly 1 million people perished from COVID. It's 873,564 people to be exact, and 66,995,533 cases that had been reported. And by all accounts, these numbers are probably actually undercounted. The scope of this tragedy is absolutely immense. And one of the things that it was sort of clear, not just to me, but to everybody, well, most people, I would say here, is just how much of that tragedy is rooted in this incredible arrogance, ignorance, and criminality of the previous regime. We are where we are because the layers of tragedy sort of overlapped in this incredible way during the 2020. And you're absolutely right. The uprising that emerged from that in the midst of it all sort of laid bare all of those problems for the world to see, and we saw the world sort of rippling from this center point, or at least this flashpoint that happened to be Minneapolis. So in some incredible way, when I say that I was processing this extreme historical phenomenon while it was happening, it also was happening in my hometown. I mean, it was still is. We're still working our way through these layers of problems, trauma, tragedy, really, grief that is so palpable. At the same time, I can't help but realize that to say, nearly 1 million people died from COVID, it almost feels like we've managed to just sort of get over the incredible numbers, or not get over, but are unable to truly process what that means. What the scope of that tragedy really is. And I look back at the drawings. Those numbers that are in those drawings they seem almost insignificant in comparison to where we are right now. And of course, we're now in the midst of the biggest wave yet. Incredibly. 1 million cases in one day in this country. That just seems completely mind-bending.
This long duration of the whole COVID situation led you to an obviously very long series of drawings, of posters, right. 225 in numbers. Yet, did you also reach, while working on the series on an everyday basis, Did you reach a point in time where you just had enough of working on it, which actually, which also leads us to the questions, what you were working on after that, what you will be working on after that, and or what you are keeping yourself busy with right now. So first question, was there a time when you wanted to get rid of the project, of this long-term project? And second question is, what keeps you busy right now?
I don't know if there was a moment where I just couldn't, I didn't want to do it anymore. In fact, I think I would say, and it's an honest answer, I don't think there was a moment where I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. The sense of urgency and a real community that built around the project made it so that my relationship to that work was very different from anything else I've done before. And I understood this fairly early on. There were moments where I would feel tired and perhaps it was there were days where it was harder to get things done than others, but never really a point where I couldn't do it anymore. The challenge of working on a series that is this big and still as an artist be sort of motivated to continue to contribute something new and important, or even feel that there's anything left to say, became more and more challenging with each new drawing. It was a different task when I was making a, say, 7th or 10th drawing, and a different task entirely when I was making the 210th drawing. And so it didn't get easier in that way. It got harder. And but I feel like the moment where I decided to finish it on the election night was the right moment to close the project. Many people still ask me if I feel the urge or need to continue working in that way. And I say that truthfully, that it is both. I absolutely have days where I feel like I should be kind of continuing with this reporting on what's happening, because obviously the pandemic is still with us, and the as I was mentioning, the kind of continually expanding tragedy is taking place. On the other hand, I felt that the work articulated all of the ideas that to me resonated within that moment in time. And I don't know if I would be able to continue bringing new perspective, except for acknowledging perhaps the new events, the January 6th, multiple things happening. What keeps me busy right now? There's lots of things. And I guess a little bit like Sheida, I work on multiple projects at the same time. But one thing that is sort of keeping me busy, especially right now, is I kind of coming out of the COVID report project, I was approached by the Knight First Amendment Institute out of Columbia University in New York. And there's a kind of annual yearly program that is organized by this First Amendment Institute that focuses on issues related to the First Amendment of the American Constitution. And each year there's a different theme. And the theme for this year was lies and the law. And I was sort of approached because so many of the drawings in the COVID series really confronted that very issue. The problematics of this of the big lie, the sort of endless lies, in fact, that characterized the previous regime, were so present that and contribute to this amazing sort of confusion or this kind of second guessing of what is real or what is true in the world that we live in. So anyway, I am a contributing artist to that program for this year, and I am working on a body of work that specifically focuses on the issue of lies. And aesthetically or formally, it's the work that emerged from the COVID report. So there's a kind of a formal continuity. But I'm thinking about it as sort of pulling out a singular issue from this mass of problematics that the report acknowledged, and just spending a little more focused time unpacking those ideas specifically. So that's
Right.
that's a sort of a big one for me, and I'm hoping to have this out as a publication later this year.
My last question to you today is, your Labor Camp website runs under the credo that art is immaterial and belongs to no one, but at the same time it belongs to everyone. Would you please elaborate this a little bit more? What's your, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to your recipients, to your viewers, to our exhibition guests, and so on?
Yeah, it's funny how you write something 20 years ago and then 20 years later,
it's still on the internet.
What was I thinking? Well, I will say though that I guess part of that sentiment, I think I still feel that some of that is true. And I will say that the important thing for me today is to think of art as a social act, as an act that involves not just me, but somebody else, whether it's one person, 2, 10, etc. And acknowledging that and acknowledging the fact that what we create ends up either helping to describe, define, shape, negotiate the space between us is essential to the way I want to work. I want to be as an artist. And the report project really did teach me that in many ways. It happened multiple times in my practice over the years where folks sort of took ownership of my work in ways that revealed to me that the work had a kind of utility that went beyond my initial intent. I try to be really mindful of that. I try to look for those opportunities and maybe even construct the sort of spaces within the work where that moment of ownership, taking of ownership of that work is more likely to occur. So a kind of porousness that allows folks to enter that space and own it. I think the report project was huge in that regard for me. Like I said earlier, somewhere along the way, my thinking about it changed, relationship to that work changed. I understood that I wasn't just doing this as a kind of communique from me, but rather understanding that there was a kind of service that was unfolding that folks were looking for, counting on, expecting, and finding important in their sort of their daily processing of that really complex reality. So I still feel like I kind of tend to this work the way one tends to a garden. I'm a kind of a custodian of it. And that is also one thing that keeps me busy today.
Right.
And Frank, thank you. Thank you and Atsetse. Thank you for hosting the work there and bringing it to a wholly different audience. I'm so proud that the work is there and that the first presentation of this work outside of US happened in your space.
We are very happy to have you here. This is the core work of the whole exhibition. I mean, Sheida is still listening, but I'm telling this anyway. So even if the exhibition would only have consisted of your 225 posters, it would already have been a full exhibition. We like that you like the way we presented your poster series in a totally other way than it was presented before in the US. Right. And so we are very thankful that you agreed to be part of the exhibition, Thanks so much. We know that that even in the US, in I think a newspaper called the Northwesterner or something like this. This is what our former project coordinator of our international studio program has sent us. That even local US newspapers reported on the show, on your participation in the show. That makes us very proud. The US should be proud to have you there as a critical observer and critical non-citizen. The Polish citizens should be very unhappy and sad not to have you there in this particular moment of political difficulties in Poland right now. To not have you as a Polish citizen there. However, thanks for the talk. Thanks again to Sheida Soleimani. Hopefully next week or so we will be interviewing Petr Bielui from St. Petersburg, as well as Florian Göttke from Amsterdam, and who else is and Marta Tuomala from Helsinki, from Finland. These are the three artists we couldn't have here, as well as we couldn't have you here. Let's see when this happens. So let's keep in touch via the internet and our social media channels, Instagram and Facebook, because the other three of your colleagues couldn't make it tonight. Good night to the US, good night to Providence, Rhode Island, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Ulrike has still something did I forget anything? I didn't forget anything, so I'm very happy. Good night, thanks a lot, and bye-bye. All the